Am I on, Chris? No. Is that working? You can hear me in the back? If you can hear me, Paul, raise your hand. Can you hear me, Paul? You can't hear me? Just see my mouth moving. Turn me up. How about now? Okay, good. A few administrative things first. Looking through things we've passed out through the class over the last several weeks. One of the things we passed out was the age of the earth. And what we said, sometimes when we're trying to teach people, they have this and this and this. But this has 68 different ages for the age of the earth. Some is when they scientifically measured using this particular procedure, they said the time was too small to count, just in seconds. And others have multiple millions of years old, 50 million, 100 years, 100 million, 260 million. I know the earth for sure is how old. Yeah, at least my age. And I can think about my mother and my grandmother, even my great-grandmother. So I know it's 250 or so. So here's all these ages. If you need this in your file when you talk with people, we're glad for you to have a copy. Anybody? Or you want one over here? Okay. Another thing we passed out, I think just a couple of weeks ago, I suppose everybody would have one, but just I had these copies. And that has to do with the church has always existed on the earth. And I know when we talk to people trying to teach them, they wanted to have, the church wasn't always here, and it kind of came back into existence. And really Campbell, they're in Kentucky in the 1800s. He was really the one that established the church that we know now. Well, what we have with this outline is the church has always been in Iran, claiming to have 750,000 members. J.C. Choate, anybody heard of the missionary J.C. Choate we talked about? This was, he was the missionary for the church in Boston area, Highway 128 Church of Christ, interviewed this man, Dr. S.S. Chan, and what they say basically is that they began with the wise men that went to Jerusalem, went to Bethlehem, saw the Christ child, left their gifts, was warned in a dream to return to their homeland by a different route. Well, you read that in the scripture that they were told to go by a different way. Anyway, it says that has been handed down by the fathers to their children. They also say that they sent a group back to Jerusalem, was there and heard Peter preach, went back and established the church in their homeland where they lived around on the other side of the river. That would be the Euphrates. Anyway, just anybody want a copy of this as you try to teach other people? Okay. It always helps to have a little history. There you go. Now, the other thing we had was an outline. Let me find it here. Hang on. First I have this before we get to that. The 613 laws in the Old Testament that the Jews had to follow, things to do, things not to do. Everybody get a copy of that wanted that as you try to teach people about how they had to live. And we see that in Nehemiah about following the law. The law was read to them every year. They had to stand and hear it. They knew what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, what to do when they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So one person over here, I'm moving off camera, here we go. I asked Chris if he could have a lens that would be slimming. He says, yes, we could have a lens that would make you look slimmer. I didn't ask, but it is interesting they could do that. So we had that one. We also had something about the Jewish months. You know, it'll say this month, this month. This little outline tells you what that is in the Julian calendar. Anybody needs a copy of that, about the days of the calendar? 2 calendar people. Boy, one in the front, one in the back. I'm moving off camera, people. Don't go off screen now. I'm still here. You can hear my voice. All right. Now, these things are nice when you're trying to teach people. And so you have that, the calendar months. Seemed like we had one other thing, but I think you got all you're going to get. Oh, I have one copy left, one copy that explains about the gates of Jerusalem. You know, those gates all around, they rebuilt, what they were for, what happened there. Anybody want a copy? I like the sheep gate, and I like the one about the furnace gate. The furnace gate. What was the furnace gate? And you're thinking, well, Brother Brant, that's where they baked bread. Can you imagine? They go down there and hear this. That's where they bake the bread primarily. And what do you think the sheep gate was all about? That's where the sheep came in and out for the sacrifice. And the horse gate, that's where the horses came in and out for the armies. Anyway, so we've got all that passed out. Now we're down to the last thing. And if in the beginning of things, I have one more thing of the laws if anybody needs that. I also have 2 outlines of what we've been studying. If anybody missed out on it to start with, like you're late coming to class and you didn't get a complete outline of what we're studying, nobody needs that? Good. Okay. All right. That's the last of the passing out. Now, this is the last class for Nehemiah. The next class, through the end of, how many weeks are in August? How many Wednesdays in August? 4 or 5? Need to pass these out. Can I have a couple of people? Pardon? 4? Okay. So you guys get a couple of these. This is our next study. This is the study of Ezra. Who can tell me something about Ezra? Anybody? What do we know about Ezra? And you're thinking, well, he was the one that went to Jerusalem before Nehemiah. He went with the law to teach the people. And really, he went about 12. You need 2? Yeah. You need 2. He went about 12 or 14 years before Nehemiah. So they were kind of, in the end, working together. Now, I'm still here, guys, even though I'm not on camera. Hey, I'm here. You want? Need one over here? Okay. I like teamwork. You sisters are going to work together. You want one of your own. There we go. So anyway, that's why you see, as we read in Nehemiah, 1 or 2? Just one. Is that 1 or 2? Okay. There you go. Might be 2. You count them. All right, we're getting to the end. I hope everybody has one. Only have 2 left. Okay, everybody has one. Good. Anyway, we'll start looking at Nehemiah. Now, if we hadn't have broken up class, we would have been on to something else. But we talked about Nehemiah. Try it again. We talked about Ezra a little bit in introduction to Nehemiah because he went first. So we're going to kind of do it the other way around and look at Ezra. So we're back to our lesson tonight, which is chapter 12 and 13. Chapter 12 and 13. Just kind of coming down to the end of it. Now, what did you notice most as you looked at your lesson for Nehemiah? What did you notice most? What was the thing that stood out in your mind? Anybody? And I'm thinking they just couldn't stay on track. As you read in chapter 13, we'll look at it verse by verse in a moment, or question by question, but they just couldn't stay on track. As soon as Nehemiah went back to the king and came back a couple years later, they were right back where they were. When you think about what they agreed that they would keep the law. Those 613 things I passed out to you, but they just couldn't. They couldn't refrain from marrying the wrong people. They couldn't refrain from doing business on the Sabbath, seventh day. They couldn't keep the gates closed on the Sabbath as they were supposed to. I mean, it was just, they were right back where they were. So when Nehemiah came back, he just reestablished it again. I can't imagine how that would have been that my teacher would be so furious with me that he would get a hold of my head and pull out my hair. Does that get your attention? That's what he did. Anyway, let's look at our chapter 12 and see what we're going to find. Looking there on page number 9, point number B, what is the significance of the registry for the priests and the Levites? Why did they have to have the registry, the genealogies? What was that all about? What did you put on your page? I just put down a few words. What I put down was they had the right to serve and lead. I don't know the number of times in this class that we said something about how important the genealogies were. I mean, you needed to know, they needed to know, there needed to be a record of not only, who you were, but you were in the right lineage to do a certain work. So to identify the Levites, they had the listing, right to serve. And then question number 2, what type of record had been kept during the reign of Darius the Persian? That would be the king. What kind of records were kept? What'd you have on your question? What is it? Well, that's the question. That's the one. The question 2, you're on the right track. The fathers and heads of households. I mean, it wasn't just enough to know who the Levites were, who the priests were. You needed to be able to identify your family and what family you belong to. And why was it so important? Why was it so important to know what family you belong to? Now, of course, everybody, of the groups, they belong to the tribe of Benjamin, or they belong to the tribe of Judah. Among those, there were different families, obviously. It wasn't all just one big family, 42,000 people. But the family, why is the family so important? What is it?
The biggest importance was to show the lineage of Jesus.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, the lineage of Jesus would be primary importance, obviously. But what about everyday living? Just everyday living. Why was it so important to know what family you belong to? Uh-huh.
You're so-and-so's kid. I know him, he's a good guy.
Okay. Okay. You're right on the right track. My family grew up in, and the time when half of Pabst Brewery, the beer people, It belonged to my relatives. But when they became involved in religious things, they sold it. Well, it's gone. When my sister went to see my uncle, really I guess great uncle, she was tracking the heritage. She was doing the lineage. Remember, he keeps all those things like the people live next door, been dead 200 years. And the uncle opened the door, and she said, "My name is Elaine Brandt." And it was Virginia Brandt. This. We'll be coming here for the money. We've spent it all. All right. She said, "No, I'm just trying to track the relatives." Now, having those few things, and here's, roughly 85,000 people from various families. Now, think little to know what family you belong to. And you're thinking, that would determine what area of the land you were going to live on, what city you would live in, what trees, fruit trees and vineyards would be yours. Have records. Now, I've thought about that through the years. I've taught this at Bear Valley a few times when I was teaching in the school there. They were in captivity. When they went off into captivity, I don't know how all that worked out, but what did they have to take with them? The records. And when they left under the direction of Cyrus, what did they take with them? Records. And when we read in Nehemiah, at two places at least, verse after verse after verse after verse after verse gives us the lineage of different people. So they had that, the heads of the household. And that would, of course, involve in the end what land would be would live in. Now, we did talk earlier about populating Jerusalem, and how did that work out? How did they populate Jerusalem? We talked about that last week. 1 in 10, they had to live in Jerusalem. That was their choice. You could live there. Now, if you could trade off relatives, but that's how they populated Jerusalem. The rest went to live in their district or their city. Number C, the dedication of the wall. Question number 1, what was the dedication? What did you put down? I don't know. I have several things. It talks about the dedication of the wall. What did you put down as you read those several verses? I know when you read a lot of verses, it's hard to get it narrowed down in 2 or 3 thoughts. Deanna, what you? Levites they were singing. They had the harps, the lyres, and the cymbals. And what did it say? The instruments of David. Remember how we talked about that a couple weeks ago? How that if you read in Chronicles, how that he stationed the Levites in the temple with the harps, the cymbals, because God told them. And as you read other places, it tells how to make them of silver. Even the lyres, they were a 10-stringed instrument. It even says 10 strings. Well, if you're going to follow God's direction, what would you of? Silver. And what would your stringed instruments be? How would they be made? They had to follow direction. So really, it was a time of rejoicing, and wouldn't you be? I don't know, 52 days on the wall, but it took them almost 100 years to be established again in Jerusalem. You remember they sent Zerubbabel back? That was in 538, 538. And you come down here with Nehemiah, somewhere in the mid 400s. Years roughly has gone. Zerubbabel came back to build the temple. 70 years back to do the teaching. And here we find, we're talking about Nehemiah, he comes later. Here's how things are just in a terrible state. And he's serving the king. And the king recognizes what? That he's sad, his businesses fell. And he asks, what is the problem? And he explained about Jerusalem. And the king says, and he asked to go back. And he went back. Remember what we talked about? He not even went back himself. Went back with a group of men, went back with armed guards, men on horses for protection. The king's out pay to rebuild. Gave orders to the people that managed the forest for logs and wood. So they went back. And the wall rebuilt 52 days. About that. We talked about those things. Please recall they had hymns, as Deanna said, they had the cymbals, the harps, the lyres. The people were purified. Well, number 2. Who commanded Nehemiah of Judah on the wall? Who accompanied them? I said, who accompanied them? Well, I had the singers. And can you imagine? Off to the left, off to the right, and there they were. And earlier we looked when they talked about the singers. How many singers were there? And you're thinking, Brother Brent, everybody knows that answer. It's 174. So roughly how many would have been on each side? 85, I guess. But they were singing, would have been hearing. If everybody was gathered to Jerusalem, who would be hearing the singing? Can you imagine the voices of roughly 180 people? Who would have been that? All of those people outside the wall. Something was changing. Well, we'll read a little later about that, but they were singing. Of course. Right. Number 3 was heard of, well, that's what I guess it's talking about. Was heard afar off. What was heard afar off from what was heard? Well, I just said that, the rejoicing, the singing. I also put down here that men were appointed over the chambers. That's the food storage. The rest of the in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah gave. And why were they giving as you went through the chapter? Why were people bringing gifts to Jerusalem? Yeah. But remember what we said? Why did they have to do? I mean, they were directed. Why was it needed that? And Don's thinking they had no land, right? They had no land. They had no way to grow crops. So they brought those things for the priests, for the Levites, because that's how they were cared for. And they were glad. The chapter 13, it's almost what they said they were going to do. They forgot they forgot the direction. I hesitate to say it again, but really, we live today in 2020. Did you see that thing about 2020 on the 24-hour clock? that when it was 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, it was 20 minutes after 8, 20 seconds in the year 2020. There. But anyway, never going to happen again, they said. Well, I guess it couldn't in our lifetime. It just couldn't. So they were back where they were, not following, not doing, even though they said they would. Hey, here we are. Praise the gospel. They've been coming to Bible class, coming to the services, listening to the preacher. They're growing, they're developing, they're maturing. And the next thing we know, they're gone. You know any people like that? Can you think about the parable of the sower? I thought about that when I looked at this. In the parable of the sower, when they made the explanation, Jesus made the explanation about the parable of the sower. The seed was sown on the hard ground, just, gone immediately, nobody obeyed. But some, stony ground and grew, and some was among the thorns and it grew, but choked by the weeds. One says it was pleasures and evils of the world. What's he saying? Some obey. I don't think anybody here, nobody here, no one here, if I said, tell me you're going to be faithful. Okay. Just is all you're going to get from me. As soon as my children are gone, I'm going to be gone. I'm just coming to church so they'll have an idea about God. And we see that happening too, don't we, sometimes? So here, said they were going to be following, and then they didn't. So we're getting a re-examination here. Let me have a drink. So when you see question number 1 in chapter 13, what did the people learn from the book of Moses? Looking there in those first few verses. And the thing we see is a reminder about the Amorites. Why was that? Why shouldn't they be living there? And as you read along through the verse, because they did not feed when Moses came out of trying to establish themselves, and they refused. Now, how long are we? If Nehemiah is in the early 400s, how long ago had they left Egypt and came into the land? They left Egypt about 1500 BC, give or take a few years. And now we know they were in the wilderness. We know they wandered around 40 years because of disobedience. So give them maybe on dates, and different people figures different times. But 1,000 years ago, the Hittites and the Moabites did not feed those that were coming in to the land. Does God forget this way? No, God doesn't forget. So in our lifetime, that's just a twinkling of an eye, so to speak. God doesn't forget us. He doesn't what we've done in a positive, helpful way. He doesn't not request forgiveness and repentance involved with that. He does not forget. So when Nehemiah came back, there the people were. Two, I have written down, what grieved Nehemiah bitterly? You see that verse? What grieved him bitterly? Verse 7? Yeah, Well, just give us the basic thing you got there. Uh-huh. Okay, there you go. The high priest relative, really, he was against Jerusalem from the beginning of the wall with Tobiah. And not only was he not a Jew, right? But here he is living in the Jewish temple, on the temple grounds, where things should have been stored. He's living in the storehouses. Just sort of set up shop there, and there he lived. And when he came back, bitterly. I don't know, do you ever feel bitter about things? When you hear certain things, do you ever sort of, that word very often. But there are probably things that really cause. There are things people shouldn't be doing, things they shouldn't be saying, that they should know better. Did the high priest know that he shouldn't have his son wasn't living I found? So we get down to question number 3. What did Nehemiah have to do? What did he say? What did he have to do with the rulers? What had happened? Now he's only being back. What's he find? The Levites talked about that. But again, how important is that? Well, that's how they were supported. They had no other way. Had no land, had no property, any animals. But they were supposed to bring 1/10 of their crops. They were supposed to pay a certain amount of money each year, to keep of the temple. They were supposed to bring the firstborn of Kansas, I think, can't think of the city. Anyway, he worked his grandfather's ranch, and they sell about 3,000 cows a year. Well, I don't know how many, they have births every year, but they'd have to have quite a few, wouldn't they, to sell that many every year? So, calf yet. Well, that calf would belong to who? The priest. Now, if you've got 300 cows and you have to give 1 or 2 a year, is that really going to be business? The same way with the sheep and the goats, you give the. They just weren't. It wasn't for sacrifice. That was for their survival, for their living. So they just weren't doing that. And again, left them without a living. There also comes question number 4. What did Nehemiah see the people doing on the Sabbath day? The 7th day. What were they supposed to do? Nothing. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? It was a day of what? Rest. It was a day of rest for you. It was a day of rest for your animals. It was a day of rest for your servants, your hired people, those that did your work. Everybody is resting. Well, it was just another day to them. Just another day. And of course, that and selling, things were coming to sell. They just weren't supposed to do that. Now remember, just as we read just a couple ago, they had agreed that they were going to keep the Sabbath. They were going to close the gates. They weren't going to trade. But when Nehemiah comes back, what's he see? Just doing what they want to do. So they had try it again. When were the gates of Jerusalem closed? When were they supposed to close? Well, what did you have? Verse 19 has, as it grew dark before the Sabbath. Now, if it's growing dark before the Sabbath, what day are we talking about? Friday. Because the days were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when we count the days today, we think, you know, in the Greek text, it's mono sabbato, 1 of 7. 1 of 7. What comes next? 2 of 7, 4 of 7, 5 of 7, 6. So we're on the 6th of the 7 days, and for Saturday is the 7th. And what's supposed to happen? Nothing. They were supposed to close the gates. There wasn't to be any working. Everything was to be quiet. Until when? Till after the Sabbath. And really, to the rising of the sun. Did they know those things? Did they know that was what they were supposed to be doing? So here, I'm a guy that sells, I don't know, bacon. No, they wouldn't. I knew I got you. But seriously, say I'm in one of the have barrels of wine. Why would I want to sell it on the Sabbath? Not supposed to, but why would I want to? Make more money. I'd make more money. Supposed to do that. Gate, no selling, don't do any work. And it wasn't just for you. Let me say it again. It wasn't just for you, the owner of the vineyard. It was for everybody that worked. The people, crushers. I think we said earlier about how they were, crushing the grapes on the Sabbath. But anyway, just shouldn't have been doing that. So you have those things, opening and closing the gates. What was wrong with the marriage of the Jews? What is it? Yeah, marrying the people of the land. Who were the people of God supposed to marry? The Jews. Who were they? The Jews. What would be one of the negative things about marrying a non-Jew? Besides violating the law of God. In everyday life, what would have happened? What did it say happened? Well, they didn't know the language. They didn't know the word. Their offspring didn't know anything. Now again, the adults are in violation. So when Nehemiah comes, separates them. Well, that'd be pretty harsh, wouldn't it? Sure it would. I hesitate to talk about the situation today, but do we see any instructions about that? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 13, about non-Christian, they're content for you to live with them, well, then you're not to leave. I mean, is it possible that a Christian somebody could obey the gospel and the husband or the wife didn't, and you find yourself married to a non-Christian? If they're content to live, there could be any way you might know in your mind was not content to live with you? Can you think of any reasons? Anything that explained what it meant? Knew. But again, what they wanted to do. And Nehemiah ends. And what comes next is the Malachi. Maybe 15 years later, maybe 20. I think a generation. What are the people doing? What is he confronting them with? The same drifting or leaving of practicing. And that, by the time you get to Malachi, that is the end of new writings. And by the time Christ came, they were doing all manner of things. Can you imagine? Help you. Well, Christ talked about things that they should be doing and weren't doing, things they should have been doing, or things that they shouldn't have been doing that they were doing. And here we are today, living as a Christian. And as old Leonard Gray would say, in my heart of hearts, I will not sin. What's the possibility of that? Zero. Zero. Now, from time to time, we may outgrow certain sins. We just don't